Hello everyone, welcome to English Language Resource. In today's presentation, we'll study different poetic devices as used by Walter de la Mare in the poem The Listeners. Often in poetry, the meaning of the verse is not literal, it's figurative, and this figurative language is very important to poetry. So, understanding the elements and devices of poetry will help you better comprehend the meaning of the poem. Let us see. Paradox. The listeners present two examples of paradox, both of which are used to heighten the meaning of a specific moment. In line 22, the traveler senses the presence of the listeners by their stillness, answering his cry. This is an apparent paradox here. The silence of the listeners is not an absence. The stillness of the listeners becomes all the more creepy in that it represents beings who refrain for some reason from reacting to a human presence. Similarly, in line 35, the poet describes the silence surging backwards after the noise of galloping hoofs disappears. A surge usually implies a wild and powerful movement that comes with a massive sound, such as that of a wave or a large crowd. In this case, the surge is that of silence, which is the absence of sound. The listeners contain several examples of anaphora, and the poet places all of his anaphoric words at the beginning of the line to make their presence clear. The effect is measured and rhythmical, making the reader lean into the next inevitable phrase into a deeper meaning to the actions. Enjambment lines usually do not have a punctuation marks at the end, while most of the lines in the listeners are end stopped. There are a few examples of enjambment. You can see line 13 to 15 are all enjambed. The lack of end stops in these lines serves a couple of purposes. First, it slightly speeds up the motion of the poem. Second, it subtly reflects the situation the traveler finds himself, where he expects things to proceed a certain way. Sibilance. The poem is filled with instances of sibilance, contributing to a whispery, ethereal atmosphere. These phrases encourage the reader to encounter the poem as a ghost story. The hissing sill sounds send a shiver up the spine. The words silence, still, stillness, and listen, listeners are the touchstones of the poem. These quiet words mimic what they describe. The most intense example of sibilance come in the line 35, almost at the end of the poem, with the phrase silence surged softly. Imagery. The listeners relies heavily on imagery in order to communicate the atmosphere of the story. Visual imagery is important in setting the scene, as shown by the use of moonlight, forest ferny floor, leaf fringed sill. However, the most interesting imagery in the poem is oral, that is, what is heard or not heard. In the last lines of the poem, the traveller's departure is described exclusively by the sounds that the listeners hear. Caesura. Most of the lines in the listeners are complete, unbroken by punctuation. The few examples of Caesura stands out by contrast. For example, in line 7, the traveller's repetition of his question interrupts the flow of the line with a question mark. The effect of these interruptions in the steady flow of the lines is a disturbance, reflecting the traveler's uncertainty and growing desperation. Similarly, line 26 to 28 contains a Caesura as well. They represent the traveler's last effort to break through the stillness of the world he has encountered, which then collapses back into unbroken, even lines. Alliteration. The poem contains a few points of alliteration. The strongest of these comes in the line 4 when the speaker describes the setting surrounding the house by using a phrase forest ferny floor. The alliteration in this line pulls the reader's attention to the encroachment of nature on this man made structure. In the poem The Listeners, the poet has used metaphor, of course, but the occurrence of metaphor, as you can see, is only once, that is in the line 19, in an air stirred and shaken. Hope you understand. In case of any question or confusion, drop your queries in the comment box.